This is the Doc and Krueger cast, the official podcast of Doc and Krueger Games. Season 1, Episode 9, Story Games. Hello friends, welcome to another episode of the Doc and Krueger cast. I'm Chris Krueger and I'm joined today by Adam Doc Brackin.
Hey everybody.
And today we're going to be talking a little bit about story games. Now this is our sort of wave 2 of this season of the podcast, as we mentioned in our setup episode. The idea is that we sort of release all at once all the materials that have to do with the game that we just released. So this season is all about the Roll With It system. Which by now is available. So we hope you've checked it out and enjoy. And if not, please go check it out and hopefully enjoy.
And if you like this episode, stay tuned because there will be more.
Yes, there will be more. So what we're going to be doing at this point is having weekly releases as opposed to releasing all at once like we did before. Topics that are tangential to the Roll With It system. So this season, we're going to be doing a bunch of design talks. And then later in the season, we'll actually be talking a little bit about other systems that we've played that influence the Roll With It system. And then, of course, in the future, we'll have other seasons to talk about other systems. But that is in the future, and we are here in the present. So let's talk about the present.
The present, indeed.
And so story games is something where if you're listening to this, you're probably familiar more or less with the idea of story games as opposed to maybe what you might call traditional role-playing games. But for those of you who maybe are wondering what we're talking about, or it's like, I thought that all role-playing games were story games or vice versa. Doc, do we want to sort of talk a little bit about what we mean by this, some definitions?
No. Wait, I mean, yes.
That is why we are here.
So I would put forward that, yes, the point of all tabletop, pen and pencil, or paper and pencil role-playing games is to tell a story. And, you know, you can talk about who it is that's telling the story, if it's the players that are telling the story, if the GM's story, that kind of a thing. But really what we're talking about in this episode more than anything else is this idea that some games, by the virtue of their mechanics, let's say, are geared towards telling a story more than being a mechanic. Mm-hmm. So sort of the traditional argument, whether that be for video games or other types of games, is that story game systems are somewhere on that give and take spectrum between stories as a game and games as a story, if that makes sense, that one lives within the context of the other. I've argued this myself. I've written some papers on it, presented on it. But where I firmly entrench myself in this one is that you really can't have one without the other. But what you can do is you can heavily influence one with the other. Mm-hmm. And so this episode is all about the way that you can design a system specifically to be geared towards telling a story.
Right.
Which I would argue is a little unconventional. I would say that that's probably not what the norm is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you go to just your local comic and game shop, you look at the role-playing games section, you just see shelves upon shelves of books for role-playing games.
If you're lucky.
If you're lucky. We're very lucky to actually have that where we live.
Yeah, we have one of the largest game stores, comic book stores in the country at our back door, Madness Games and Comics. Mm-hmm. And so
shout out to you guys.
Yeah. But, it's amazing to me because you can go in, like you're saying, and see the shelf, and then you've got the big D&D section that's there, and every time there's a new edition, then it starts out real small, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger as they phase out the old edition and put in the new supplements with the new adventures and the new everything else. And then you've got other major games like, I don't know, What are some major ones?
Pathfinder's
a good example.
Call of Cthulhu has been kind of there you go. Off and on.
There's a time when I'm going to show my age here, like time whenever Shadowrun would be, a big, huge section.
Yeah. And Shadowrun's still relevant. GURPS, that one's a little bit less. I mean, it's still around. You still see it.
Oh, sure.
I'm not sure how recently they've published anything for it,
just
but
pretty much the whole D20 section kind of thing. And every game store or comic book store is going to do this a little differently. They're, some are going to do it by publisher, and then some are going to do it by title, and I don't know, some may do it by designer. I don't know, honestly. But what really it's going to come down to is the type of story that you want to play. Mm-hmm. And I chose my word very carefully there, because when you're playing a story, I would argue that what you're doing is you're focusing on the mechanic of your character, and that you're leveling up the character, and that you're getting new things for your character. Oh, how could I forget Star Wars? The new Star Wars system, Edge of the Empire,
Excellent
and the others.
system.
Yes, a great, fantastic system with its proprietary dice and that kind of thing. So this season we're going to talk about kind of all that stuff, the crunchy bits and the dice and all of that. But this episode specifically is about those few and far between, I would say, games that are, honestly, I would argue that they exist mostly in the indie space.
I would agree, yeah. I think that the ones that you see that are mainstream that sort of take on what you might call like an indie sort of mentality or philosophy are still sort of sticking to what I think of personally as more traditional RPGs, tabletop RPGs.
Sure.
But kind of with some mechanics or with some approaches that will move you a little bit closer to that indie mentality. But the indie mentality, some people might actually find completely foreign because a lot of times it's very light on rules. There aren't a lot of very defined rules for lots of different situations. And there's some systems even in the sort of more traditional side that have kind of a general approach of here's how you address this sort of conflict or this sort of obstacle or something like that.
Right.
And then you can kind of adapt it to what you need.
Thin books, if you will.
Yeah, thin books.
Often setting agnostic, but not always.
In fact, actually, one of the fun things about lots of indie games is that they are very tailor-made to a specific setting or idea. So not even just like here's a post-apocalyptic setting, but a post-apocalyptic setting that's going to highlight a particular aspect of these sorts of stories,
right? Which
might be, say, survivalism or gray morality or whatever else you might say is the focus of that game.
Yeah.
Shia LaBeouf. And so some of them are like a little bit quirkier because like it's a sort of low investment kind of like we just threw something together really quick because we had a cool idea.
Well, it's an easy in, easy out, I guess I would say. And we probably have versed ourselves as well as any other gaming group in those, just because we've been meeting for years and years and years with what I like to think of as kind of our system of the week. It's probably more like system of the quarter or system of the month, if I'm honest. But
closer to that.
We've done dozens and dozens and dozens of different systems experimentally, and we create new characters and we do new stories and we do new settings.
We rotate GMs too.
Yeah, rotate. So we know a lot about these which ones are story driven and which ones are not. We tend to stay away from the more crunchy games, if you will.
Yeah. It's probably worth saying too, something that you kind of alluded to earlier in the episode, Doc, that, in a sense, all role-playing games are collaborative storytelling games. And so
we're not hating on the crunch by any means at all.
And so I think that, in a way, what we're kind of saying is the difference between having a system that is about a particular type of gameplay where the story is either not separate from, but it's kind of tacked onto it. It is kind of resultant, it's emergent from these systems or from whatever the players create outside of it or whatever, in the cases of like the big old D&D section at your local comic book shop, is like all the sort of like pre-written scenarios that you're running through. In a sense, I kind of like to think of those as analog video games, which I realize is kind of a reversal of like
that's interesting.
The actual history, but it's basically the GM is kind of acting as the computer or the developer in a sense, who is facilitating this experience for the players who are playing through the game.
I won't argue with that point, but I will insert that in context, it makes sense. That's not a standalone kind of a thing, because what you had early on was a simulationist approach. You had these guys who just absolutely loved Lord of the Rings and stories like that, fantasy worlds. They wanted to play in that a little bit more. So they created a system by which they could tell those stories. And then that was more about the fight mechanics and winning and losing, but the story happened narratively and naturally. And as we then came up with pastiche systems, that means loving love letters, let's say, to those systems, rather than copycats, because that would be a dirty, dirty word. What we ended up with was
great art to steal.
Yes, that's right. As long as you steal the right things. But what you end up with then is a whole bookshelf of different ways to play different types of games and in different settings and so on. And early on, the early stuff moved a little bit away from the simulationist and more towards, I would say, setting specific things. And then, and less about the having lore books as a separate, it's all kind of constructed into it. Shadowrun is a great example of that as the cyberpunk. But then what you ended up with after that was, I would say, coinciding with the video games that were also role-playing games. We were sort of co-inventing, this works as a system, and this only works in it as a human interactor.
Yeah.
And then you get into the MMO space, and suddenly you start seeing the MMO influences come back out into tabletop roleplay. Mm-hmm. And I think the irony there is now there's a dialogue between those two, between the digital space and the analog space. Mm-hmm. So that makes perfect sense to me. But yeah, I think the core of the whole argument, maybe the crux of it, is simply this: we don't have the ability to tell stories with our computers yet. At least not generate them. We can use that as a tool to tell a human story, but the human story is still fundamentally the creation of the human mind, and that's where the GM comes in. Mm-hmm. And so if you use the crunchy system as just a way of presenting that story, and then the people around the table interact and tell the story, wonderful.
Yeah, and that was going to be kind of like I think the fundamental point that we're always going to come down to with this is that ultimately it comes down to the GM and the players and how they choose to use these tools, if you want to put it that way. So you could have D&D, just as, an example, kind of like one of the most well-known systems of this sort. You can have that be played in just a purely mechanical, we're doing nothing but talking about how this monster's attacking me and how I'm attacking back and what dice I need to roll for that. Mm-hmm. And it can be all the way on the other side of the spectrum where we hardly roll at all and we're just sort of role playing in this setting. So really it's all these games are going to have elements of both. And so kind of to distinguish a little bit what we kind of mean by story games, I think is those that maybe not all the time, but either implicitly or explicitly have mechanics that are geared to help guide the story in a particular direction, beyond just kind of a sort of skills and attributes and abilities driven approach, if that makes sense. So in D&D, for example, you're telling your story, you're going through this experience, and you need to figure out, okay, do I succeed or fail at doing this thing? And the system's going to tell you that. And if you fail at it, here are some consequences, like you might lose this amount of health or something like that. Whereas in a story game, you're going to have a lot more mechanics that are kind of going to influence how your character ought to behave, or other things that kind of are more, I'm trying to think of a good word for this, because there are conditions in a lot of these different systems that kind of say that here's how this is going to affect your character. But I feel like story games might have more conditions, as an example, and it's not the only thing that will do this, that affect kind of your character's mindset and where the plot should go next, not just the GM maybe following the book or reacting to what the players are doing.
Yes. So I think maybe at this point we should throw out a few titles.
Yeah.
Where you just took me to with what you just said is the Powered by the Apocalypse various systems. What are some of the systems that you think of in that?
I think Fate's a really good example. Powered by the Apocalypse, like you said.
And that one has lots of subdivisions too, I guess we should probably point out. It's basically an open source system that people have taken, right?
Yes.
Is that the understanding? So like the Warren, for example, is in that world, and Fellowship is in that world, and
or not that world, but that
world is the wrong word.
But system
is the way.
Engine, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah, the engine is a good.
And
way
kind of
to
the same way that D20 Star Wars and D&D are essentially built around the D20 system.
The D20 system. Oh, that's a great comparison, yeah.
So there are a lot of systems that will say mainstream as opposed to indie. Not that that's neither one's a dirty word.
Right.
But you might have some gamers who are more familiar with that mainstream RPG space who will think of systems as kind of being like the mechanical drivers. The same thing applies to, say, Powered by the Apocalypse,
right?
Except that system has a lot more stuff built into both its rules and its philosophy of how to play it that will sort of make it more guiding the narrative and less guiding the moment-to-moment action.
That is a really, really good point, because whenever you make a variant of a D20, ultimately you're still got that core, I'm going to roll a 20 and a modifier and all that stuff's going to be there. And what's going to change then is sort of the attributes and the skills or the whatever. But maybe even the core stats won't even change. With something like Powered by the Apocalypse, what you've got is everything has to be rewritten, but the core philosophy of how the game is run is going to stay the same, because what you have is individual powers for that archetype, the player archetype.
Or they call it moves.
Moves, yes.
And it's also a difference in philosophy. We'll get to this a little bit later in another episode.
Yes, we will.
About in, say, a D&D, you say, I'm going to attack this guy. And you say, okay, here's what you need to roll to figure out how you attack this guy.
Right.
Whereas and it's not going to sound too different, but it's actually quite different fundamentally, where Powered by the Apocalypse actually states in the rules, you ignore the rules until there's something in the narrative triggers a move. And so, for example, in something like Apocalypse World, which is the game that started that system, you might have something like a move might be go aggro. And going aggro is basically any time you're kind of trying to escalate the situation into using force, or you're trying to take something by force, et cetera, et cetera. And then there are very specific things. You roll 2 dice plus an attribute, but the attribute actually will change from game to game. So different attributes kind of tell you what sort of story you're supposed to be telling. And so, to contrast that to the Warren, for example, the Warren actually doesn't have any direct combat attributes or moves because you're playing as rabbits, and the tendencies of rabbits is more survival and more like kind of like outwitting people than it is direct confrontation.
Yes.
And so
sort of flight or fight that was a fun game too.
And so in that particular case, you can even see how these two games based on the same system take you in different directions, because one will allow you to go aggro and one won't.
Right.
Unless you sort of like bend the rules somehow, which is, of course, always an option.
Always. And I think it's actually more of an option with these story-driven games, whereas you have to fudge a mechanic or lie about a dice roll, which, by the way, it's completely within the purview of a GM behind the screen. That's the purpose of the screen, by the way, to lie about your dice roll. And that's how one of the ways you can manipulate those more crunchy systems. Whereas within a more story-driven system, you don't have to lie about anything, because sometimes, we still roll dice, but sometimes there's no dice roll being affected here. And some of these systems, the GM never rolls anything at all. And I love when that happens, whenever it's all the players are doing all the rolling, or we'll have another episode again about diceless systems, but I think that diceless plays in very strongly to story-driven systems. So
I think that non-story-driven systems, again, to maybe draw another contrast, because sometimes like the lining gets a little bit fuzzy here.
It does, with all these terms being thrown out.
In a way, it almost becomes kind of
you're taking notes, right?
Yeah, you'll sort of know it when you see it. And I think too, that people might kind of, if someone pitches something as a story game, they usually come from this indie space or have some experience in this indie space where they kind of know what that connotation means.
That's true.
Whereas people who just call it a role-playing game are probably thinking more in the mainstream kind of sense.
So if you found us through the Google, you're like, yeah, guys, I know all this.
And so it's kind of like the square and rectangle thing, like not all story games. We'll get to this here in just a second. Most story games are role-playing games. Not all role-playing games are necessarily story games in this sense.
Well said. Well, I feel like we should do a shout out at this point to Lady Blackbird and Tales from the Wild Blue Yonder, because what we were just talking about with Powered by the Apocalypse kind of works here too. You've got these keys that you turn, and Lady Blackbird is a very specific prepackaged scenario where you're handed your characters, but there's actually I believe it's a fan-made way to create your own characters within that system, right? It's a companion. But we've run, whole campaigns. Actually, our recent Camp Lucky Strike release, which we recorded quite a while ago, it was done with an experimental take on that, and it worked beautifully. The way to interact, have the characters interact on a fundamental mechanical level.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the thing is Powered by the Apocalypse, Fate, Tales from the Wild Blue Yonder all have in their rules the mechanical like rewards, like the feedback loops and like the things that they will have you roll for,
right?
Give you points for, reward you for,
right?
Everything is kind of pointing back to the story and to the characters.
Yes, that's true.
And that's one of the main differences, I think.
I agree,
because what will happen is, say for example in Fate, you do something that is kind of in character, and especially if it's something kind of causes trouble for you, it's not just like the smart, here's what I should do tactically, but rather like, this is a really dumb idea, but my character would do this. And the system will reward you for doing that because it's kind of rewarding you for putting the story before victory, quote unquote.
Well, I would go a little further and argue that character advancement is not actually as stressed or important or on the forefront as a less story-driven game. In other words, one could argue, and it has been argued, that the purpose of Dungeons and Dragons is that your personal character's story arc, if you will, is going to be driven by them getting better at fighting and becoming sort of the perfect ideal version of your character type. So you start out as kind of a terrible rogue, and you end up as a level 20 rogue, king of the rogues, who's the master rogue of rogues, and that's the inevitable arc of those types of games. And that's not a bad thing.
Right.
But you compare that to something like Fate or Atomic Robo, and what you end up with is a character that is, they're already kind of a master whenever you start.
And in Fate, for example, they actually say like the best characters are competent and proactive.
Yes.
And there was one other thing, I'm drawing a blank at the moment.
But the character advancement in systems like that then are, you know what, I didn't really use this thing that much. I want to change that. I'm going to adjust my character so that they're becoming more specialized in a different direction. So you actually sacrifice a thing to replace it with another thing. And that's actually explicit in Atomic Robo in the way that's done. Because you switch them out, you sort of rotate, and the higher up on the grid, the way that character sheet works, the higher up on the grid, the better at it you are. And so one of the things you can do at the end of a session is to flip them, to just flip the two. And that's so wonderful to me because it means like, I didn't put enough priority into my ability to action science, so I want to have that at higher. And those types of design decisions, I think, are the fundamental bones of a story system that must be understood as to the why and the what. It's almost like the belief and the manifesto is coming out in actual play between sessions in that moment. Whereas you compare a wonderful system like the Star Wars system, and you keep going long enough, you're eventually going to have super excellent masters who have 37 career paths, and they're just they could do all the things, and it's not realistic. And I don't know that realism is what we're going for necessarily. We're going for heroism, but going from 0 to 20 is not the only way to play a role playing game, and I think that's the point.
Just to quickly touch on a few other sorts of story games that are out there that aren't necessarily kind of role playing games as we think of them. There are things like Once Upon a Time, which is kind of like a card-based storytelling game where it's almost like improv with it's a little bit competitive in a sense where you're trying to sort of like trip people up or sort of see you can tell like the best story. And so like there's a little bit more of like a mechanical strategy to it. So, that's something that you might call a story game. Baron Munchausen is one that comes to mind.
Oh, great example. That's a drinking game, frankly.
Yeah. It's also, they pitch it as competitive boasting.
Yes.
Which is also, you're kind of like trying to tell the best story of a certain sort by kind of being the most impressive and coming up with stuff. And so
Baron, tell me about the time whenever you took the dirigible to the moon.
Yeah, that sort of thing. And like, part of the objective in that one, again, is to kind of like trip people up in order to make it harder for them to tell a good story so that yours can shine brighter or something like that. And so, these are fun games, but both of those particular examples happen to be like slightly competitive in some way, even as much as they are cooperative to some extent. When we're talking about story games, we're talking about role-playing games. We're talking about, and I think highly collaborative too. You could say even of like Dungeons and Dragons that a good GM isn't going to be competing against the players.
Oh, but that is so fundamental.
But there are some games that will leave it a little bit more open. And of course, like if you have a GM who's like kind of out to get the players, that's a big problem, and that's something that can happen in any game.
It's true.
But I feel like games that are sort of centered around, say, combat and having rolls for every attack and stuff like that, and HP that counts down, and when it goes below 0, you're always dead, that sort of thing, kind of lend themselves a little bit more easily to this sort of like player versus GM mentality. The idea that you have to, say, balance something for the players.
Yes.
Whereas a lot of story games are kind of built so that they kind of inherently have a balance, because like you said, advancement isn't a big focus of these. There might be some advancement, but it's usually very slow burn or these are games that are meant to be played as one shots or as kind of like very short campaigns. They're not meant to be your 2-year long epic that you've been telling with D&D, that sort of thing.
I love the 1-page systems. You know, sometimes they have little contests, and so if you do a little search for them, you can find just hundreds and hundreds of these little 1-page systems.
Like the 200-word RPG challenge.
RPG challenge, yeah.
It's been around for a couple of years now.
That's a wonderful one. I thought it was 400 words.
I'm pretty sure it's 200.
Oh, okay. Well, that's the reason why I've never won. But we're going to dig deeper into player versus character in a future episode. We're going to do a whole episode on that one because that is so important, I think, to understand.
And so I think kind of like wrap up this talk a little bit, what I wanted to touch on is not just kind of like trying to define the differences between these two types of role-playing games, story games versus more traditional mainstream, whatever you want to call it, but how it changes the way that they're played. We've kind of touched on this a little bit, but from both a player's perspective and a GM's perspective, Doc, what do you think are the ways that playing a game, a story game, where the story is the goal in a sense, how does that change your approach to playing these?
Well, for me personally, as a GM, I always want to make sure that the story that's being told is the story of the characters and the story of the players. And those are different things. But of course they're married, but I want to make sure that it's not, wow, Doc, you told that great story. I'm so glad our characters could be a part of that. But rather, wow, Doc, I really love that world that you created for us to tell our story in. So that's kind of my thought process in that. And as a character, whenever I come to the table, I want to make sure I'm not monopolizing the time. There is a tendency sometimes for an individual character, or rather an individual player, to dominate the table. We talked about that in a previous episode of the Doc and Krueger cast, but I think that that's okay, especially if you have a group that you love and that know you and that you have a certain type. Because, you know, we all play sort of archetypes, I think. And if you're comfortable with the support character, then that should be it. But we also have a group that is a table full of GMs. Yeah. And so as a table full of GMs, we get to shift and take turns. And I think that GMing really helps you be a better player. And playing helps you be a better GM. And it's reciprocal. So whenever we have a sit-down time together, and it's one of these story-heavy games, as it tends to be for us, I think whenever we start with this notion of, so guys, what kind of story do we want to tell? What sort of setting do we want to tell? And we've even gone around, usually we have our GM picked out, but not always. But sometimes we'll just throw out, okay, give me an idea. What do we want? And then I'll be like, heist. I want a heist in there somewhere. Okay, that's interesting. And what do you want? Oh, well, I'd love to have flying aces be a part of it. Oh, okay, interesting. And what do you? Oh, political intrigue. You know, and so by the time you're done with it, you're like, okay, we've got this this interesting heist with a political intrigue, which is also going to have flying aces. Oh man, that would be perfect in Wobbly Yonder. Let's go ahead and do a sequel to our previous game of Lady Blackbird, but with new characters and on a new world of our own making, but with the same kind of steampunky, you know, islands in space kind of a deal. And we did, and it ended up being about a train robbery. From my that was my suggestion, so this is what I think of it as. But it ended up being about a train robbery. But it also, you know, it went all the way up to the echelons of the political structure, and we also had this sort of noir kind of. It was just great,
shifting loyalties.
Yeah, it was a detective story ultimately. So I think whenever you really approach it with that idea of everyone at the table has a voice, then they're going to contribute to the metaphor here, song, as, you know, an a cappella choir. If you understand that that's the goal, everyone can tell the story. The worst thing that you can do is to dominate the voice. That's an awful thing to do.
And I think also it helps when you have a group that kind of is thinking in this way too. But I feel like, you know, as a player in these games, you know, my goal, like we all fall into this tendency of like, hey, my character has this goal of like, I'm going to win this fight, or I'm going to complete this mission, or fulfill this quest.
Nothing wrong with that.
And that totally plays into a lot of different narratives. And so that's totally natural. But I think that what I tend to find is, especially when the system rewards you for kind of like I said earlier, deliberately putting your character into trouble.
Yes.
Or
I do love that.
Or like, we actually, if you've listened to Camp Lucky Strike, probably by the time that this episode is aired, we will have gone through that season. And so, spoiler alert if you haven't listened to it yet, but there's actually a place in the game where our GM said, you're going to take in condition, what is it? And basically he said, like, someone's going to get shot. Based on the situation at the time. And so it's like, whether that means you're just injured or you're dead is kind of up to you. And so I'm like, well, I think the best thing for the story right now might actually be that my character dies.
Yeah, and it was.
And I volunteered because we were basically at the end of that campaign. Yeah. So it's not like I was going to be missing out on gameplay.
And that's the benefit of knowing you're doing 4 sessions too, is, I can sacrifice my character. That's okay. I can have a noble death or an ignoble death. Yeah. And in fact, that one was. But yeah, I think probably just to shore it up and tighten the laces on this thing, the, that idea of player having a voice, but the character also having a moment is important. So the players need to work together, even if the characters are at odds. And I think you know what I mean when I say that.
And so it kind of, it requires a little bit of kind of like a sense, like a meta sense of directing the story in a particular direction, along with the system kind of pointing the system in a particular, or the story in a particular direction. And there are going to be people too who, like, maybe stick more hard and fast to the rules, and some who will sort of bend the rules a little bit more, like even in these story-based games. Because sometimes the rules are actually designed to point you in a very, very particular direction. And so they kind of require everyone to follow the rules very closely in order to achieve the result that they're trying to achieve with that. And then there's some that are more open-ended, more rules light. And that's, I think, one of the things that I really like about these story-driven games is that they don't really get in the way of role play. It's just kind of like, we're telling our story, we're role playing. And whenever we do need to kind of do a thing, here's a quick and easy way to resolve it and then move on. You pick the game that's going to best facilitate this type of story you want to tell. And then you just all work together to kind of make it memorable. I think that's kind of like the end goal, is we walk away from this having enjoyed something that we thought was entertaining and moving, perhaps, and not just kind of like and not to say that this can't be achieved in a D&D, but we find that it's easier for us to get to the place where we felt this wasn't at least just a grind of lots and lots of fights.
Exactly.
But rather a really interesting narrative.
Yes. And one of the best phrases of all is, we're just going to abstract this out. When the GM says, okay, we're just going to abstract this out. Go ahead and do one roll. It's going to represent the whole fight, and then we'll move on. Because the fight matters, but the sort of the agency of the blow by blow is not as important as what's happening in the story. And you don't want to lose your narrative tension instead of that different kind of granularity. I might argue that that's like when Indiana Jones pulls out his pistol and just shoots the guy, right? The urban legend behind that is that Harrison Ford was, I don't know, he was like sick that day or something, and he didn't want to do the fight.
He's want to get the.
He's like, I think Indy would just shoot him, And so you can have those moments in your role play where it just happens. You don't even have to roll it.
Right.
And the GM can be just like, that's beautiful. I love that. And if there's a mechanic for rewarding good role play, like an Artha system or something like that, or some kind of a fate point or whatever, you give it. And you're like, wow, that's great role play. I love that. 5 XP, whatever.
Yeah. And that can exist too, like we said, in these more, these mainstream RPGs as well.
Of course. Yeah. I think the big takeaway here is this. You can have a game or a system that is focused on the narrative, focused on the story, but that is not to say that it is somehow a lighter system or a less crunchy system or a less mechanics-oriented system in that way. It's more about the development of the overall narrative, the story arcs of the characters, as opposed to the mechanical progression and ability progression and upping of the stats of the character. That's my final word, and I'm sticking to it.
Works for me.
All right.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us for this episode of the Doc and Krueger cast, our discussion on story games. Obviously, we've just barely scratched the surface of this topic, but we don't want to keep you here for 12 more hours.
There will be more episodes. It's fine.
There'll be more episodes, and we'll definitely hit on this. This is a theme I think that's going to pervade probably in some way or another everything we talk about. So yeah, I'm Chris.
I'm Doc.
And we'll see you next time. The Doc and Krueger cast is a production of Doc and Krueger Games, jointly hosted by Adam Doc Brackin and Chris Krueger. The theme music was composed by Nick Krueger. The Roll With It system is available now. You can find it and our other games through our website, docandkrueger.com.